Thank you very much. I will keep my role here very, very brief. I will just very quickly introduce our three panelists. Dr. Abdulla Mosa Tayer from the Gulf Future Center. Welcome here.
Thank you.
Dr. Mitchell Belfer from the Euro-Gulf Information Center here in the middle. Welcome to you as well. And Dr. Zimmt from the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel.
Saudi Arabia actually has never stopped reforming since 1932. There were all the time resistance for reforming and also trying from the kings of Saudi Arabia to push for reform. Very conservative society, Bedouin society from the beginning, and then they took it from the scratch till now. We have, I can say, a modern country to some extent. King Abdulla, actually, who died in 2015, was a pioneer in reforming Saudi Arabia, especially with empowering women. He is also called the father of the scholarship. We sent about 200,000 Saudi students to study abroad in the industrial countries. Almost 30% of them were ladies. And Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in the era of King Salman, actually is pushing wild for reform in Saudi Arabia, continuing in empowering women. Most of the issues about women actually that we used to avoid answering questions about are now gone, and the change actually is deep, and it's targeting the hearts, minds, and behavior of people in Saudi Arabia.
That doesn't mean that the Iranian regime should not be concerned. It should. Both because of the geographical scope of the demonstration, with almost 80 cities throughout Iran joined the protests, and because of the socio-economic composition of the demonstrators. Most of the demonstrators in Iran came from among, I would say, young workers belonging to the lower strata of Iranian society, which is very interesting. Because the middle class in Iran, in Tehran, those who joined the Green Movement in 2009, were usually, I wouldn't say against the regime, but more critical against the regime. These are the people the Basij like to beat up. But this time, it was a segment of the population which for years has been considered to be supportive of the regime. So the geographical scope of the demonstrators and its socio-economic composition was another evidence which exposed the level, the extent of public dissatisfaction and frustration from the regime's policy.
Now, there are three areas that I would really like to address because they are deeply affecting European approaches to the region and European security calculations. The first is on, and by the way, I will do this both, look at it through the Iranian prism and also through the Saudi and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. Because there are basically three security-related issues. You have the issue of nuclear weapons, of course. We can call it nuclear options because it's not just about the programs, it's about the options that are available. We can talk about it in terms of terrorism and asymmetrical violence, and we can also talk about geopolitics. And these are all things that are very important for us to keep in mind when it comes to Europe and European security. A great man named Bob Dylan, you probably have heard of him, once remarked that some people will rob you with a fountain pen. And in fact, if you look at the way that the P5+1 engagement was, the treaty, it's robbery through a fountain pen. Because as it has been indicated on this panel previously, actually Rouhani doesn't have as much power as we would love him to have. Real power in the country rests on the shoulders of Ayatollah Khamenei. The Ayatollah, the supreme leader, I mean it's not a joke, that's his title, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, makes all political decisions. If he says to Rouhani, go and engage with the European institutions over nuclear issues, that's what Rouhani will do. If he says don't, well, Rouhani will stop. And so until it's Khamenei who comes and addresses this chamber, or Khamenei goes to the United Nations, then unfortunately we're not talking about anybody with any real significance in the power-making, let's say, in the decision-making of the Islamic Republic. So, and there are two terms always to remember, the term khode and taqiyya. These are two terms that basically in the Islamic Republic, they allow lying. You can lie to your opponent to get an advantage. That's what the two terms, and they're very widely used. Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, was very keen to promote the idea in his teaching that you should and could lie about your strategic position. So when they say we don't want nuclear weapons, we don't have to listen to them, we just have to watch their movement. And so when we look at the sanctions relief, and we saw that sanctions relief was supposed to infuse the economy with money, well, it doesn't. It infuses the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with money. They control the economy. And so it's not a coincidence that the more money that they got, the greater their ambitions became in the region around them. And so I think it's very important to note that inadvertently, and perhaps, you know, there's the saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and perhaps people did have good intentions when they wanted to engage further the Iranian state on this matter. But actually all we've done is line their coffers so that they could make regional conflict easier for them. And they're going to keep doing it until those coffers are running dry. The sanctions were actually working, and Iran was changing slowly and subtly, but it was changing, and it was more constrained because it had less resources to wage war. The other thing to keep in mind is that from almost all readings of Iran's nuclear program, it's already a nuclear actor. It didn't want and didn't need at the time to build a big fancy nuclear program like you have in North Korea. What they did instead is when they finished the cycle in 2008, they produced something like 100 RDDs, radiological dispersion devices. Everything strategically that Iran has been doing in the past 40 years has been clandestine operations. Their navy is based on clustering. They're asymmetric from the beginning to the end of their strategic orientation. And the way that they build their nuclear program is much in the same way. They wanted to build weapons that could be easier. RDDs, by the way, we commonly know them as dirty bombs. You know, it's and basically the process that Iran went through already in 2008 allowed it to have about enough dirty bombs to create nuclear terrorism in up to 100 places. And this is a danger. This is what we have to contend with. It's not Iran as a conventional actor, but Iran as an...
I'd be interested to know what the proof of extreme links are with Qatar. And then finally in Iraq itself, how does Iraq fit in to this rebalancing act? I'm very aware of the Iranian influence within Iraq. I'm very concerned about it. But I think of Kirkuk, where the Peshmerga who I visited on the front line have been displaced by the Quds units, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards abroad. And I think it is destabilising Iraq and changing the nature of it. And that is of deep concern. So those three areas, if it's possible for the panel to respond to that. Thank you.
Right.
I can say a word or two just quickly about Qatar. Maybe to show the linkage at the very beginning. I mean, it's not something that came out of nowhere. There's been a deep concern about Qatar's behavior long before this crisis last year. For example, the relationship not only with the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course we know that there are more moderate people within the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are also more extreme people within the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar seemed not to make the distinction between the two. And of course there's the case of the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, The al-Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda. And when you've given money to an opposition group in Syria, and that opposition group either becomes, merges, or always was a group like Al-Qaeda, I mean, then actually the ambiguities vanish pretty quickly. Because even if they can claim that they don't control the group, financing it in the millions and tens of millions that are in unaccountable money is going to go to destabilization. And the Qataris are responsible for the rise and financing of terrorism in and for the Muslim Brotherhood and in the al-Nusra Front. I mean, that is one thing. But the dispute itself, I think it's also important to put into a perspective, because the disputes in the Gulf also was not because of 2017. It was also not because of 2013-14 and the issues around there. This is a dispute that goes back to accession, when the current emir's father, in a bloodless coup, replaced his father. And basically, Qatar has been, since that time, in a state of kind of suspended animation. And instead of trying to deal with their internal issues, they project outside. It's a deflection tactic. But the danger of Qatar today is the fact that they've invited and consolidated Turkish military presence in the Gulf. And they have been kind of developing a military relationship with Turkey. And they've also been supporting the AK party, which is also connected, of course, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this I think is going to kind of dog relations with Qatar for quite a long time, because they've basically invited another actor in, which doesn't represent the momentum of the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and especially, in terms of the, let's say, the political futures that the Gulf countries have identified for themselves.
A short word on Yemen and a short word on Iraq. I don't know if it's possible to restore stability to Yemen, but I do know that the longer the war in Yemen continues, the more Houthis are dependent and becomes an Iranian proxy. I remember 2 years ago, I think, when Chief of Staff of Iran, Petir, stated that Iran wants to build up naval bases in Syria and Yemen. One of the leaders of the Houthis said, don't try to do that, because we will become the graveyard of Iranians. Today, I'm not sure he would say the same things. Iraq is moving towards the next stage of Iranian activity. There was a conference in Iran a week ago where Iranian ambassador Iraj Masjidi gave a speak, and he said, we are no longer in need for Qasem Soleimani and the military activity in Iraq. What we do need is to go and use economic soft power in Iraq. That's first thing Iran is trying to do. And the most important issue is Iran's meddling in the upcoming elections in Iraq. You have already seen this report about Qasem Soleimani visit Iraq, trying to somehow negotiate both with Haidar al-Abadi and the Shiite militias, and this issue of how to incorporate the Iraqi militias within Iraqi military forces is something the Iranians are very conservative, and they would like to continue their influence through this process.
Yeah, it's always when you do an event on the Middle East, it always spread out to the entire region eventually, sort of have a spillover effect. But maybe to pose a question that takes this to the European continent. I also served in the special committee on terrorism, and I think from a European side there is generally a great concern over the export of extremism from the Middle East, and I think. At least I can give my short perspective, and then I would like to have a comment from the different perspectives. But it seems like there is, have been for many years, a religious arm race going on between the Muslim diaspora here in Europe and their different connections back to different countries in the Middle East. We are seeing mosques and Islamic institutes sponsored by Saudi Arabia, by other Gulf countries, by Iranian proxies, by Turkey, by almost everyone in the region who has economical power to do so. And oftentimes the more extreme part of the diaspora have chosen to play these countries out against each other. So if Saudi Arabia doesn't want to fund the thing, we can go to the Iranians, we can go to the Turkeys, or whatever. And I think this, first of all, of course, becomes a European problem when we are dealing with fanatic Islamic extremism here in Europe, but it also puts a big strain on the bilateral relations between Europe and especially, I would say, Saudi Arabia, but also, of course, to an extent, Iran and Turkey. But Saudi Arabia is, in the European context, very often singled out as the main problem in this area. So I would maybe just like you to give your thoughts on this, or your comments on this, and how it affects what you've talked about so far, which is primarily sort of the internal dynamic between the countries in the region and the spillover in the region. But I think this is maybe one of the issues that have the most effect on Europe-Gulf relations at present day. So I'd like to take on the ball court there and hope David would forgive me for that.
Do you want to